Greetings, all. Yet another wonderful conversation. Um, if I were Bernadette, I would want to be connected to any one of you in participating in this conversation. Um, and um, a case conference like this would inform um, a social worker so beautifully about all of the important considerations with regard to working with Bernadette. So I'm just going to reflect on a few of the themes in your conversation. As Mariah points out, it's so important to convey respectfulness and admiration of all that Bernadette has achieved. And that will provide a validation and a framework from which both of you can move together. And as Dalen points out, Bernadette is capable of doing extraordinary things based on her attitude and desire alone. All she needs is the know-how, and that's where we come in. Several of you spoke beautifully about the importance of recognizing the broad diversity in the aging population. As Jennifer points out, age is fluid, and it's so important to avoid making assumptions just based on a client's age. Just as important as it is to avoid making assumptions based on any other demographic factor. Self-perception is central. And as you discussed, sometimes a person's self-perception is very divergent from cultural stereotypes related to being a particular age. In that regard, as Jennifer points out, it's very important to listen to Bernadette relay her own story in her own way and to try to understand who she is from her perspective. You rightly pointed out the importance of attending to medical issues. As Tara points out, there was a mention of her memory loss. So I would really want to understand if there was something organic going on, or if it was medication that needed to be adjusted, or if it was just part of the grief reaction. As I'm sure you know, all kinds of neurological problems can ensue when medications interact, or if dosages are inappropriate. And so this medical workup is a critical early step. You all seem to have consensus with regard to the importance of attending to practical matters. Finances, dealing with the house, a driver's license, health insurance, power of attorney, and other healthcare issues. And it is especially important, as you say, because Bernadette hasn't been the person in charge of dealing with these issues in the context of her relationship. So there is a learning curve here, and the worker will be her partner in crime in embarking on that learning journey. You had wonderful ideas for addressing grief issues. a grief group, um, and and also, it's important, as you point out, to um, uh, help Bernadette avoid um, uh, getting lost in the transition from one set of family responsibilities to another, and therefore neglecting the necessity to do her own grief work. And that is also important, as you point out, because it would be easy for Bernadette, as it would for many of us, to throw herself into a new set of role responsibilities rather than deal with the painful aspects of moving through the grief process and her own life transition. Several of you talked about the importance of Bernadette's personal agency and self-determination. And Sienna's great story about setting up all the helpers for your mom, and then your mom promptly firing them, and several of you having had that experience working with clients. Who said, "I used to think I was doing a great job if I got everything orchestrated and found every resource, even ones that the client didn't ask for. Then I realized that I was not actually helping at all. My success is not measured by how many services I set up or if they actually do stay in their home when that's their goal, but rather if I met my client where they are and that they're and respected their own sense of power and control." As Jennifer points out, the only obstacle I see in working with Bernadette would be the guilt that she feels towards not wanting to fall into that same pattern of caretaking. But as several of you point out, she doesn't have to choose between the roles of caregiver and being independent. She can explore both of those roles simultaneously. As you discussed, a task-centered approach to moving through this transition would be helpful, beginning with very small steps that would allow her to build confidence. You had so many wonderful ideas about how to assist Bernadette in this way. As Lisa points out, I would even consider going with her to the local community college and speaking with a counselor. Tara has an idea of elder hostel trips, and Diana talks about sewing and cooking classes. These are all great ideas. And as several of you pointed out, it's very important to identify and reinforce Bernadette's social connections, and that includes people she has been connected with in the past, and also new connections. Several of you discuss the importance of involving the whole family. As Tara says, the first thing I would do is to make sure I was meeting with the whole family to do some long-term care planning. And as Roanne points out, both Bernadette and the family may struggle with the challenge of planning because of anticipatory loss. It's not always easy to engage in discussion about what you will do when you lose capacity or when a parent loses capacity, and very often families avoid that conversation, and it becomes problematic when when they're faced with the transition. We actually had a variation of this conversation in our previous discussion about dealing with disaster. It's important to have a plan, but we would all prefer to think that disaster or aging or disability was not going to happen to us. And there is a measure of magical thinking here that if we ignore it, it won't happen. So that's a delicate task that a social worker has to assist people in confronting those uncomfortable issues. You generally agreed on the importance of self-determination and respecting Bernadette's prerogative to make her own decisions and her own choices, and also acknowledge that those choices may be different from the choices, for example, that her daughter might make for her or might counsel her to make. If a social worker working with Bernadette were to integrate this case conference, she or he would be prepared to assist Bernadette in a very mindful, resourceful, and creative way. So I thank you for that on Bernadette's behalf. Hope you're enjoying your spring break.